know, one of the things about Dennis Kucinich that I think anyone who has known Dennis's career acknowledges is that Dennis is often someone who says something that gets eye-rolling at the time. And later people go, you know, Dennis Kucinich was right. I certainly remember that about the Iraq War and many things. So I have lived too much and known Dennis too long to ever not be interested in the conversation that Dennis is having. And I think the bigger conversation that we are beginning to have as a country is one that already you sit within, Dennis, and always have. So for a lot of us who have been talking about the deeper regions of what democracy means in terms of connectivity to our hearts, to our souls, to what it means not just to be Americans, but what it means to be alive, what is our responsibility to each other, what is our responsibility to the planet, what is our responsibility to the future, that politics is not just about externalities. You know, that's what most politics is these days. They're just watering the leaves. I think we need to water the roots of our democracy. So I'm happy to be here with you, Dennis, proud to be here with you, and excited for Ohioans that they have the opportunity to have someone, not just with your politics, but with your consciousness as their next governor. And I hope that this conversation that we have today inspires and motivates people to become even more interested in making it happen.
Marianne, thank you. And Marianne and I have known each other for more than 20 years. And it's been 20 years of a constant conversation about our country, about our communities, about the world, about how do we make for a more peaceful world? What can we do with respect to ourselves to play a role in bringing about change? And what can we do to courageously catalyze change? Each one of us can be change agents. Each one of us has moments in our lives when we have an opportunity to take a stand. And Marianne and I have both been practitioners of courage and a willingness to speak out when maybe others wouldn't want to say anything, and to say what must be said in the moment, whether people would agree or not.
There have been some times I think I should have kept my mouth shut, but politics is the art of saying just enough, not too much, not too little.
Well, what I found is that there were moments where I saw people being silent in a room, and decisions were being made that could take the country into war, for example. And I felt that, notwithstanding the fact that others would be silent, that it was important to stand up and speak out. I remember years ago in my reading of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on self-reliance. He writes, above all, to thine own self be true. Every heart vibrates to that iron string, to believe that what's true for you could be true for others. He talked about going to a lecture and hearing someone speak, and hearing his own thoughts, his own words come back to him with what he described an alienated majesty. And each one of us, in our moments of thought, of contemplation, have found that there was a truth resonating within us that we wanted to speak, but then maybe we didn't. I have found throughout my career that it was much better for me that the only way that I could survive and thrive as a human being was to speak the truth to power in the moment and not be concerned about the personal or political consequences. And so what did that lead to? Well, for example, it led me to be the person who challenged the Iraq War. If you were to look on Google and you go to Kucinich, October 2nd, 2002, Iraq War analysis, you'll see that what I simply did was take the call for war, the resolution, and to deconstruct it. And in doing so, it was very easy for me to point out that all of the assertions that were being made that would take us into war were false. And years later, people understood at last that we were led into a war based on lies. Now, I don't think that I'm necessarily any more gifted than anyone else. It's just a matter of being practical and common sense and looking at something in terms of what we're being told the circumstances are, and to be ready to raise questions. Because what happens in government circles is that people are always told, well, you didn't know that. And so people are made to feel small and unintelligent, but the fact of the matter is that there is an inner knowingness that every one of us has. It relates to common sense, to practicality, and when we ask the question, sometimes it's the question that we ask that saves the realm.
Well, I think that you don't have deep answers until you start asking deeper questions, certainly. So I think it's important to ask those deeper questions, but I think at this point, it's not even just the questions inside us, but the answers that we have not been saying. I've always felt in my career that I'm not saying anything everybody I know isn't saying, I'm just saying it when the microphone's on. And I think that the American, we're decent people. I think they're far more lovers than haters in this country and in this world. But those who hate today hate with conviction. And some of the most nefarious attitudes are being represented loudly and with megaphones. And I think at this point it's time for the lovers to speak up. And I think that part of love, you can't talk about love without talking about justice. You can't talk about love without talking about things that are actually at the crux of what it means to be a democratic society. And I think many of the people who in our country are the most deeply involved with these important philosophical issues have over the last few decades sort of divorced themselves from political engagement, thinking that politics isn't a place to have a deep conversation. Well, if it's not a place to have a deep conversation, how is that going to change unless people who have a deep conversation get involved in politics? And I think that what is happening in our country now is definitely an example, in part, of what happens when some of the people having the higher conversation remain on the sidelines. And I think many people are ready to come back in, but don't want to come back in order to have the same old political conversation, and don't want to come in disengaged from things that matter most. And that's really what I want to talk to you about now. Given that this is Ohio, the question was about the Iraq War. The question today is about what's happening specifically in Ohio and issues which take as much courage to confront today as that war issue took to confront at that time. I know I've been reading about your race, and it seems to me that one of the most primary distinctions between you and your opponent, in your main opponent in the Democratic primary, is that you have an F rating from the NRA and that he has an A rating. And that Mr. Cordray has an A rating from the NRA. Now, to quote George Bush, which I rarely do, so mark this as, he did say there are issues around good people can agree to disagree. So this isn't about demonizing individuals. This is about honest debate, and particularly concerning the issue of an assault weapon ban. So I think that everybody here needs to hear your position on this and needs to be very, very clear, because once again, there are two issues here. Number one, some of you are going to hear, there are several categories here. Some of you are here, you know that you are supporting Dennis in the primary. Some of you don't know yet whether you're supporting Dennis in the primary. Theoretically, by the time you leave here today, you will know what Dennis stands for. It will be up to you and your own conscience to decide whether or not he represents a view of what should happen in Ohio with which you are aligned and about which you would say, yeah, that's what I want. The next issue is, what are you going to do about it? So we have a twofold mission here. Number one, that you become clear about what Dennis stands for, and number two, if you are in support of what he stands for, that you leave this place and make it happen. We need to pray hard right now, ladies and gentlemen. We need to love deeply, and we also need to kick ass to save this country. So, okay. So, You've got an Ohio audience, and what's the deal with guns? What's your position, and what's the position as in contrast to your main opponent here?
First of all, I think if anyone wants to understand how I look at the issue of assault weapons, you have to go back 20 years, maybe. You could go back to the time that I took office in the House of Representatives as a member of Congress representing Ohio's 10th District. Almost every day, day in and day out, I found myself challenging the United States' decisions to take us into conflict in various countries or into war. And as I saw, I would sit in Democratic caucus meetings, and I would see normally placid people find themselves being swept up into supporting attacks on other countries. When the Clinton administration decided to bomb Serbia, I organized an effort, bipartisan effort, to block the authorization of the war that was necessary to continue it. It was, I think it was Senate Bill 20 to reauthorize to authorize the continuation of the war against Serbia and the bombing of Serbia. But when I saw my fellow Democrats get swept up into the debate, it got me thinking about the genesis of war and about how easy it was for people to just find themselves okaying it. And then I started to study war. There's a hymn book or a psalm book that says, "Ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war." It's out of the Song Bag of the South, I think. Well, I started to study war, and I found out that in the 20th century, over 100 million people perished in wars, most of them innocent, civilian, non-combatants, women and children. So that got me a little bit deeper into the subject of war, and I found myself leading the effort to try to stop wars. I led the effort against the war in Iraq. But before 9/11 happened, 2 months before 9/11, we gathered people together in the U.S. Capitol. Marianne, you were there on that day. And I unveiled what was a proposal to create a Department of Peace. That was really about taking the work of Dr. King, Gandhi, and others for nonviolent conflict resolution, but it's very practical on a domestic level, looking at the scourge of domestic violence, spousal abuse, child abuse, violence in the schools, gang violence, gun violence, racial violence, all the symptomatologies of a society that was becoming unhinged. And so I saw that one time after another, the country was being led into wars based on lies and misrepresentation. At the same time, the National Rifle Association, which is connected directly with arms manufacturers, was promoting an agenda to try to make it possible for all kinds of weapons to be freely available. And at one point, Congress passed an assault weapons ban, and then that ban was left to expire. I looked at those circumstances, and I thought, well, we're more vulnerable than ever. Today, there's 8 million assault weapons that circulate in this country, so we're told. And they are weapons of war. A Virginia Court of Appeals recently ruled that assault weapons are weapons of war, and they're not covered by the Second Amendment. The same ruling was upheld where the Massachusetts law yesterday was upheld that bans assault weapons in Massachusetts. And as I got into this issue of assault weapons, it suddenly emerged in the governor's race. I didn't expect that to happen, but after Parkland, everything changed. And I decided, I looked at my record, which is, yes, 100% challenging the NRA's agenda.
You have a good solid F from the NRA.
Thank you. Yeah, prior to that, the only F I had was in handwriting in the first grade. But I looked at my record, and it was pretty consistent with trying to stop these weapons from circulating. And then, to my surprise, The other candidate, major candidate in the race, not only had an A from the NRA, but he had overturned an assault weapons ban that Cleveland had put up in 1991. And then it was overturned in 2010 in the Ohio Supreme Court, and then the same year in a case called McDonald versus the city of Chicago. Chicago's gun legislation was overturned. It affects cities across the country. He led the effort on that with the Attorney General of Texas.
Okay, let's slow down because I want to make sure everybody's very clear about this because this is a clear choice. This is very significant. First of all, once again, how many assault weapons are in circulation in the United
Estimated
States?
8 million.
8 million, okay. In 2010, there had been an assault weapon ban in the city of Cleveland.
Yeah, it stood since 1991.
Since 1991, and so for almost 20 years.
Yeah,
and then in 2010, Richard Cordray, what was his elected position at that time?
He was Attorney General. Now, what he said is that, well, it was in conflict with, the city ban was in conflict with state law, and that he had no choice but to take it to the Ohio Supreme Court. But the truth of the matter is, Attorney Generals are independent. If they don't agree with the law, or if he had agreed with Cleveland's law,
right,
he could have had somebody else argue the case, right? But he took it.
And what does he say about that now?
He said that, well, he was just doing his job.
No, but I mean, how does he view assault weapons now?
Well, no, he is opposed to an assault weapons ban.
He is opposed.
Today.
So it is reasonable, once again, just that everybody be very clear what this vote is about. So the Republican nominee for governor, it is reasonable to assume, will not support an assault weapon ban.
It's reasonable to assume.
And if Cordray is the Democratic nominee, then you will have the Republican nominee as well as the Democratic nominee will support the sale of assault weapons, the legality of the sale of assault weapons.
Based on everything that's available in the public record, that's right.
And another one of your opponents, Schiavino, is a B+ from the NRA. So I think that this is an extremely important issue. I heard you say, you were talking earlier about war and anti-war votes and stuff, and the way you talked about violence on the streets of America. You said the war has come home.
It has.
We are an embattled society, and I'd like to hear you talk about that in terms of Ohio and in terms of, as you said before, violence is such an ubiquitous issue now. And it's not just violence over there, as in wars. We have domestic violence. We have so much of what's going on, and I think citizens of Ohio want to hear what that involves in Ohio and what you would do as governor, which is what matters here.
Well, when we talk about the war coming home, it's impossible to imagine that a country can spend, one estimate is that the Iraq war would cost at least $3 trillion. Some estimates can go as high as $6. Over 1 million people, by one account, dead in Iraq, and thousands of U.S. soldiers killed and tens of thousands injured. The war's come home. These assault weapons are weapons of war. They are now on our streets. And
there are many generals and military leaders who have said loudly and passionately that these are weapons of war that should only be in the hands of combatants in war.
So I feel this is an urgent matter of public health. It's a matter relating to the mental health of our state, the physical health of our children. No parent should have to worry about dropping their child off from school and suddenly getting a call and saying there's been an incident at the school and the terror that strikes in the heart of a parent. No child should have to sit in a school and have to have in the back of their mind that their own physical safety, their mortality is at risk because that someone could burst in with an assault weapon. When I was growing up, we never had to worry about things like that.
I want to ask you a question about this because I'm curious, and I'm sure others are as well, what the power is of a governor. Because it's interesting to me that you said Cleveland had its own assault weapon ban.
Right.
What, as governor, could specifically you do? What are the powers of the governor?
Well, a governor cannot issue an executive order saying there shall be no assault weapons. I mean, you have to actually get the legislature. This has to be legislated by the Ohio legislature. complicating it is that we have a Supreme Court ruling now that says that assault weapons bans by cities are not valid. So what I would do, and Tara Samples, who we'll introduce in a little bit, my running mate, what we will do is to gather the public support in pushing Ohio to enact an assault weapons ban. Now, this is an issue. Having traveled the state, I can tell you that this is an issue in urban and rural areas. People in rural areas who feel very strongly about having access to certain types of guns do not support having assault weapons readily available. Most people who know about guns know that assault weapons are weapons of war. They're a different class. The purpose of them is one thing and one thing only, and that's to kill people, and to kill a lot of people at once.
Fast.
Right.
A lot and fast.
So as governor, what I intend to do is to lead this state in an effort to confirm our purpose of protecting our children, of keeping our schools safe, of protecting our public spaces. Because everyone has in the back of their mind, when they're in a public space, occasionally you will sense your own vulnerability.
Yeah.
In a mall, in a church, in a rock concert.
Everybody thinks differently now than we used to.
And why should we even have that visited upon our awareness? How did we get to that point where we have to consider the possibility that something could happen? What I'm saying is, I see a responsibility of a governor, in this case, would be to help reclaim that public sphere of the feeling of safety. Right. And so that's the first thing that we intend to do, and you can't do it if you don't rally the people in a campaign and say, this is our intention. We're going to get rid of these weapons. They have no legitimate place in a civil society. And we are going to lead the way to make that happen. And this primary actually ends up, surprisingly, this ends up being the defining issue in the primary. And so I'm not about to let that go for the sake of some interest group or political convenience.
So let's talk about this for a moment. I want the issues to be very clear. First of all, I heard you say just now that the Supreme Court said that a locality, a city, cannot ban assault weapons, which is why you said Cordray said he had to do what he did. But are you saying that a state can?
Of course a state can.
So a state can ban?
Yes.
So then the question is, and I'm just curious because I don't know, if the state can ban the sale of assault weapons, does that mean also banning the ownership of assault weapons? What about the assault weapons that already exist in the state?
No, they have to be turned in.
They have to be turned in. Okay.
Absolutely. You could not possess, you could not sell, you couldn't transfer, you'd have to give them up. And this, again, I see this as being a public safety, a public health issue, and relating to the security of our communities. Now, is it the only issue in the governor's race? Of course not. I mean, on our website, Marianne, we have, at last count, probably 5 dozen at least, individual issues and things that we've said that we shall do upon election.
It seems to me, not just on this issue, but really where America is right now, we will not repair as a country unless citizenship itself, the tenor of our citizenship changes. I do believe that we will get through this current crisis. I believe in my heart we're going to get through this. But if we're at the same place within ourselves on the other side of this that we were when this happened, given how much our own...
I'm sorry, this is not working. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
What happened to the thing? I put it back on for you.
We're
okay.
Good, go ahead.
All right. The Republicans sometimes talk about private-public partnership. They're talking about that in economic terms. We need a public-private partnership in terms of our democratic participation. It's not just that the government has let down our democracy. We, the people, have let down our democracy. And too often, and I think this is true of Democrats probably even more than Republicans, we think, well, I elected the right person, Now I don't have to think about this stuff for a while. And none of this that Dennis is talking about, and this applies not only to this race, but to any that you care about. It's not going to be enough for us to just elect people that are more aligned with our values. We're going to have to be on it. Because everything that Dennis is saying, even right now, he's talking about how his own power will be limited if he doesn't have a state legislature that goes along with it. So that means that voting, and not just voting, that's what all this is about. This is not just voting. It's about participating in these primaries. And on this issue, you can see how important this primary is. You know, if you're a Democrat, it can't be any more, oh, well, whoever is Democrat, I'll vote for. Some of the most important things going on are going on around the country on the level of the primary. Because even on this issue of guns in Ohio, the main Democratic opponent has the same view on guns as the Republican, right? So the issue is to know that this has got to be something that you will involve yourself with, if in fact you agree with Dennis, on the state issue, on the level of the state, on the level of the state legislature, as well as all the issues where this is impacted by federal legislation and action.
How many of you were part of the marches that occurred in March for Our Lives? Look at this. Look around. Hold your hands up. This is not a small matter. Marianne, I have to go back to the 60s where I've seen this kind of ferment. And when I was on Public Square listening to the young people speak, some of whom were from Shaker Heights, I was impressed with the degree of passion that's moving this. And because of that, I am not content to believe that even Republicans in the legislature are going to be able to ignore this issue. Because the young people who are driving this, they don't care about political parties. They are looking to be protected. They are rejecting the reasons that have been given as to why they haven't been protected. They have a very high, they have very good BS detectors. Oh yeah.
Well, they have literally, they have been shot at.
Yeah,
I mean, these young kids are looking at these Congress people and saying, I ran down the hall with someone behind me shooting me with an AK-47, you don't scare me. And they are not impressed by a spineless Democratic Party. They are not impressed. They want to see somebody do something. And they don't have the historical memory, which I have, which many of you and I are old enough to have a historical memory of a time when the Democratic Party had a soul and the Democratic Party stood for something and it didn't bow to corporate donors when it knew that that corporate perspective went against its own principles. And I think the Democratic Party is going to lose these kids. These kids are just going to go independent, or they're going to go to street politics, which is even more democratic, et cetera, unless they see Democrats like yourself and people who agree with you. You know, if you don't agree with him, then I respect that. But if you do agree with him, it's not enough to just agree. You know, I read a book called The Invention of Wings that really impacted me, by Sue Monk Kidd a couple of years ago. And it's a book about these two women who actually lived, two historical figures called the Grimke sisters. And the Grimke sisters were born into a slave-owning family in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and in time, having been converted by the Quakers, became leading abolitionists and then leading feminists. What reading that book made me think about was the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. Now, if you were anti-slavery, you might say, I think slavery is ridiculous, I think it's awful, I think it's immoral, and I would never live in one of those states. That perspective did not move the needle for one slave. Disagreeing with slavery is very different than committing your life to not on my watch. So if you really care about this, we need to step up in terms of our conviction. It's like I was saying about haters versus lovers. We have more lovers than haters, but haters hate with conviction. The love that's going to save the world now is not just the love for your own children. It's got to be for the children on the other side of town and the children on the other side of the world. Progressives, Democrats, whatever you want to call it, anybody who's committed on this issue has got to ask ourselves, what does commitment mean now? And that means to actually make it happen and not to be wishy-washy between candidates, one of whom would support an assault weapons ban and one of whom would not support an assault weapon ban. If you do not support an assault weapon ban, you have that right and I respect it. If you do support an assault weapon ban, I hope you will think deeply, not just about that issue, but about your personal relationship to a campaign of someone who would stand for that and make it happen in your state. That's what these kids are looking for. Enough with the talk. They want to know, are we going to do something? And so to me, in this and in other issues as well, when I see a candidate who would not just talk, but would actually do something, especially when the other candidate makes it clear he would not do something, it would just be the same old, same old. At what point are we going to have a rising among us? Not just in candidates, but among us, to actually make the choices in terms of the candidates that we support and the people that we make sure get elected that make the changes that we already say that we agree with.
I think we're at a tipping point here. And it's at a moment when things really do change. The potential is here for deep change. The question is whether we are hobbled by old thinking that says, well, you know, just things there that'll go to a certain point, but they're really not going to change. Actually, having been involved in politics for so many years, I can tell you this is maybe what I think it was Joanna Mays called the Great Turning. We are at a moment of a turn here that is quite different. And if we can see it, we can help to join that with our, on every level, politically, economically, spiritually, and push it. And I think the young people are hoping to have support from their parents, their grandparents, to be able to usher in a new era. So I've always lived on the threshold of that possibility, and today I'm feeling it. And it's one of the things that has caused this candidacy to come forward, because I think we're finally arriving at the moment when the kind of transformative change that we've held so close as a possibility, and sometimes hoping against hope that it could happen, that we can actually make it happen right now. And we should not let our own disappointments from the past cause us to lose sight of something new that is happening that we can help propel. So this, whatever the legislature would look like in 2019, it's going to look much different if we all join this effort to change the political landscape. And I think we're there. I believe we're there, Marianne.
Historically, American democracy does move in cycles. And we do seem on the tip of a reemergence. I think that especially with what happened in this last presidential election, America feels to me like a giant who was kicked in the gut. And for a while was kind of stumbling and couldn't even see. And now it's getting up and it's starting to roar. And that's what 2018 represents. Americans are sometimes slow to wake up to things. People all over the world know that about us and say that about us. But even those who roll their eyes about us, if informed by any historical reality, know that when Americans do wake up, we slam it like nobody's business. It is time for a democratic revolution in our country. It is time, and this can only happen if there's the revolution in consciousness that goes with that, the revolution in courage, and the revolution in commitment, the revolution in conviction. You know, conviction is a force multiplier. And that's what people who hate in America have today. It's not just that they have money or technology behind them, they have conviction. But you know, if you look at the history of social justice movements in the history of the United States, if you look at abolition, if you look at women's suffrage, if you look at the civil rights movement, those who represented the great course corrections, the great movement forwards, never started out with the external powers behind them. But they had a better idea. They had a more life-sustaining idea. They had fewer people. You know, one of the problems we have, and I see this with a party that thinks, well, you know, we'll put up a candidate who has an A rating from the NRA. There's a lot of this, well, you know, we're going to dumb down the message so more people will vote for us. First of all, Democrats, how's that been working out for you? Number one. Number two, that's not how change happens. Change doesn't happen according to a lateral axis. It happens according to a vertical axis. Go deep with what you believe, and it becomes a resonant force field. It becomes an attractive force field, so that people who are almost there, thinking that, hear it articulated, see it happening, and gather unto you. So don't dumb down your message to get more people to agree with you. Be strong behind your message. Say what you really think. Say it when the microphone's on. Say it when the lights are on. And women particularly, don't care if it doesn't please them when you say it.
You spoke of the revolutionary potential of the moment. Mm-hmm. And it made me think of a philosopher of years ago by the name of Erich Fromm, who wrote a book called The Revolution of Hope. And he talked about the power of hope in the human spirit, how we have this capacity for being able to dream and imagine new structures, but then act on them. And behind that was a sense of courage that was needed to make it happen.
And love.
And love, absolutely. And so, and interestingly enough, Fromm is the person who wrote the book called The Art of Loving, which is one of the most remarkable books that have been written in a very small book, actually, but great in its import.
Changed my life.
Same here. One of the most remarkable books of the 20th century, and one of the great thinkers.
He was a longshoreman.
Well, you know, he had a lot of practical experience in life, and it made me also think about how we often hope against hope. If you remember Shelley in Prometheus Unbound, he talks about hope creating from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. And so we have to, we can look at how we've been disappointed, but what it is we're trying to create, we must never lose sight of, and keep pushing the envelope for political change.
You know, Dennis, we kind of did the hope thing in this country.
I'm going beyond that.
I know.
I'm going beyond a politicization.
I think for me personally, I'm less concerned with hope and I'm concerned with fierceness. You know, how many of us have children? Okay. Every parent knows there comes a time when usually has to do with sex, drugs, alcohol, this fierce thing happens. And you find yourself saying, young man or young lady, depending on if you have a son or daughter, that will not be happening in this house. Do you understand? Now, you are so fierce, and inside you're laughing because you actually don't know what you'll do if they'll challenge you at that point. But that look on your face, they're not going to challenge you. We need to become that way. I don't like hope that the drug dealer will not be coming into this house. That drug dealer will not be coming into this house as a mother, right? We need to become that way about all of our children. And I think, you know, there is a common anthropological characteristic of every advanced mammalian species that survives and thrives, which is the fierce behavior of the adult female when she senses a threat to her cubs. And you see this in the mama tiger, bear, lion, etc. And nobody says, you know, if you go like, camping in the wilderness, and they say about the black bears, you know, they'll be fine, leave them alone, just don't go anywhere near their cubs, they'll come after you. Because if they see you coming after their cubs, they're coming after you. And nobody looks at the bear when she's protecting her cubs that way and thinks that she's strident or has anger issues. She's doing that which the adult female of any species does if there is a conscious intent to survive. So I think all of us, men, women, all of us now at this point, it's not even just about hope. We need to become, as citizens of the United States, what all of us either have said to our children or probably should say to our children more often, which are these words: because I said so. Because I said so. And the way the U.S. Constitution is written, the power is to be in the hands of the people. We're not asking for it, we are claiming it because we said so, and that's what elections are about. And if enough of us vote, I saw a video the other day with Heather McGhee about voting. I mean, if you actually look at the views, we are a progressive nation. We are a progressive nation, even with what's happening in our Congress and our White House today. There's a bit of a tyranny by a minority. But some of this happened not because of nefarious voter suppression, et cetera, but because some people that we may not agree with used the tools of democracy more than we did. So I hope that this will be a year in which we're not just hoping, we're making it happen in a way that we have not for a while. When you were just talking about nonviolence and teaching it in the schools, a big issue in American education today is this issue of emotional and social learning skills. And social and emotional learning, and really dealing with the underlying trauma that so many of our children have, which is a kind of drive against this obsession with standardized testing, et cetera. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. I think we need to take a much more expanded view of everything that serves our children, not only their education, their health care, pre-K, and so forth.
Well, let's do that. Let's start with prenatal care, postnatal care, child care, universal pre-K. These are all essential to developing the whole child, that parents have a living wage. In my estimation, at least $15 an hour to be able to support, at least support a family initially, that people have a decent roof over their head. There are some fundamental human needs that must be met, and they're often not met, and that affects children. We have a very high level of child poverty in this state. I think the average is about 30%. In some of our communities, it's much higher. So yes, we need to look at the whole child. We need to look at children's health. One of the things this campaign is about is taking the principles that I brought forth when I wrote the bill, H.R. 676, Medicare for All, bringing them to a state level. We need a Healthy Ohio initiative, which I'll be rolling out this week, where everyone is covered, where no one has to worry about premiums, co-pays, deductibles. We know these insurance companies make money not providing health care. So I want to make it possible for all Ohioans to be covered, and in particular children and mothers, because the mother's health, if it's not regarded, the child is going to be born with multiple problems. And we're talking about early childhood learning skills as well. Every single challenge that a society ends up having generally can be traced to whether or not we cared for the children in the society. Yeah. We have to start looking at what we're doing for children in a society. And so in a Kucinich Samples administration, we are committed to the development of and the growth of the child at every level, but we understand how critical those early years are. I can tell you from my own experience, I was blessed with a mother who taught me how to read by the age I was 3. And so because of that, that changed my life. Had I not had that, I had some of my siblings who didn't have that opportunity because my parents had a number of children very quickly, and by the time they got to 7 children, it was pretty chaotic. So I would say that having seen from my own perspective the difficulties that can happen in a family when children are not getting the total care that they need, there are consequences later in life.
We now have the sociological evidence and the neurological evidence that makes it very clear how much happens in the first 8 years of life. We have a prison industrial complex that knows that if a child can't read by the age of 14, go on and build a prison bed for them because the trajectory is so fortified. And we now know how much happens. Just like when a woman is pregnant, most everything happens in those first 3 months. And most everything happens in the first 8 years of a child's life. So if we would front end our investments to make sure that our children have everything. I mean, when you look at so much in terms of delinquency, criminality, learning dysfunction, social dysfunction, drug use, so many things, if these children are treated better in terms of their health care, in terms of their education, in terms of their cultural opportunities in those younger years, then this would make a tremendous difference. You know, I was saying to Dennis earlier that our canon of laws was not only developed at a time when the voices of women were given no credence whatsoever, and that to a large extent has been dealt with, and the struggle continues, but to a large extent it's been dealt with, obviously. When it comes to children, however, most of those men who 100 years ago, let's say, were first writing those laws, and before, they didn't, until the late 20th century, most men weren't even home with children. And to see, wow, my little 5-year-old is a genius. And it's women, mothers, who are up close and personal, we've been getting for a long time. We see how much, you know, the Jesuits always say, give me a child until he's 5, he's mine. And it's true, everything that goes in there, that's an argument for, right there, for parental leave, maternity leave and paternity leave.
Absolutely.
Now, why is it that it's not that way, in addition to what I just said about men and, you know, looking at it historically? It's very simple. Children don't work, therefore they have no financial leverage. And in a society like ours, where our government has basically become a system of legalized bribery, where the undue influence of money on our politics has become so egregious, children, because they do not represent, you know, they don't have highly paid corporate lobbyists coming in and out of congressional offices all the time. We ourselves have to be lobbyists for our children. We ourselves need to make our stand for our children. If you want the American economy to be amazing in 10 years, take care of these children today. If you want to take care of your future, take care of these children today. You know, one of the things I heard your wife say earlier today, Elizabeth was talking about the experience of poverty in the United States as opposed to some other Western advanced democracies. In other advanced Western democracies, poverty tends to have a bottom. There's a bottom past which, because of medical, universal health care and so forth, people cannot fall. But here in the United States, people can fall pretty much all the way, and that includes way too many people in Ohio.
You know, Marianne, in what you just said a moment ago, it made me think about a discussion that we had maybe 20 years ago where you recommend that I read a book, and reading that book actually was important in my life. It was by a writer by the name of Gerda Lerner, and the book was called The Creation of Patriarchy. And this book really talks about how we are the heirs, and in some cases heiresses, of unconscious attitudes and accepted biases where they're passed down to us, and that they have defined our roles. They have defined who we are. They define our, quote, place in society and in relationships. And what Dr. Gerda Lerner wrote about was how we are living with the results of these patriarchal notions that have left us in a society where we're not, you know, where we're still arguing about whether women have a right to be able to have a choice over their own reproductive health, whether they should have reproductive health care. How does that happen? Well, for centuries, these attitudes, we keep, you know, inheriting them, and there's a point at which we must challenge the prevailing thinking, and we must challenge these old myths that we've inherited, because they affect they affect women, they affect men and the relationship with women, and they also affect children, because how children are treated is part of mythology that we're handed about what a child's, quote, place, unquote, is, but actually, if we start to rethink the social basis of our reality, since reality is socially constructed and culturally affirmed, we start to change it through challenging it and coming up with a new direction.
Yeah, what we're talking about here is the legacy of a perspective that basically women and children were chattel. They were owned by the man.
Right.
And that is a very different view of children than the realization that they are full citizens of the United States,
Exactly.
and that they should be given the same care and protection that any other citizen receives.
Thank you.
In the issue of these biases, which we now see very strongly, we see them in race, we see these racial biases, we see a lot of this involved with these police killings and so forth. The racial biases, the biases against Muslims, the biases against immigrants, the biases against Jews, the biases against gay people. We see this rising up of white supremacy, Ku Klux Klan, and so forth. You know, a lot of people have said that, wow, the underbelly of America, we're really seeing what was under there. Now, I don't look at it that way. It's not like I ever thought that we didn't have racism in America, or that we didn't have anti-Semites in America, or that we didn't have xenophobes in America or homophobes in America. But what has happened is that we thought we had reached a point where those things were asymptomatic enough. We thought we had reached a point on the right and the left where those kinds of attitudes would not be given serious political megaphones and platforms, much less succor, by the President of the United States of America. So what is happening today, you know, it's so interesting because on one hand, let's say something like race. It was another generation's task to get rid of slavery. It's our generation's task to get rid of racism. Because we see that so many of these things need to be routed out at the level of cause. You know, you can't just leave a little bit of the cancer, because what has happened, especially in the area of race, is that some of these symptoms have simply morphed. I mean, we have more men in prison, black men in prison today than we had enslaved in 1864. And this is where the spiritual, those of us who are dedicated to spiritual transformation, in the realization that this is fundamental transformation, comes in. Abraham Lincoln said that a nation must atone for its sins. A nation must confess its sins. And I think that some very deep, like I said before, we can't treat these issues only on the level of the externalities, only on the level of the symptoms. We must take a holistic approach. We must deal with these issues psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. And I think that's why we're reaching a time now when we need to not only recognize some of these deep biases that are a very ugly part of the American psyche. We need to not only recognize them and address their symptomology, but also for those of us who are part of spiritual communities, atone for them in our hearts, apologize for slavery, I think have a system of reparation for slavery, and so forth. I really am very excited. You know, when you look at the history of social justice movements in the United States, you cannot underestimate the power and the presence and the significance of religious and spiritual communities in their birth and maintenance. Abolition came from the Quakers. Many of the leaders of the suffragette movement were Quakers. Dr. King, of course, was a Baptist preacher. It was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So I think that the spiritual and religious communities here in a Unitarian church have such an important part to play now, not only taking a stand, but also in the power it takes to be willing, as I said, not just to be against something, but to make clear, not on our watch, that there is an intolerance of evil, but there is also the spiritual invocation of what is possible on the other side.